The charcoal paste burns the moment it touches her eyelids. Kia is 26 years old, and she feels the sting seep into shallow cuts that encircle her eyes. The wounds were made deliberately at dawn by the household cosmetician, who explained, without emotion, that broken skin allowed the pigment to sink deeper. Larger eyes, brighter eyes, more valuable eyes. That was the goal for the inspection that would decide everything. 37 days ago, Kia had been the daughter of a Nubian clan leader, promised the son of a rival king to seal an alliance. She had learned the poems of her people, memorized genealogies, and studied the management of a household she was meant to command one day. Now she kneels on polished granite in the reception hall of Lord Sinister, overseer of royal grain stores, a man whose power stretched across fields beyond sight and whose wealth was counted in human lives. 11 other women kneel beside her, arranged with deliberate symmetry. Their wrists are bound behind their backs. Their bodies glisten with oil under lamplight. Their faces are painted not for beauty, but for appraisal. They are no longer women in this space. They are inventory. Senamut moves slowly among them. His linen robes brush bare skin as he passes. His gaze lingers the way Kia once saw livestock traders linger over cattle, calculating strength, endurance, and usefulness. He is around 50, his body softened by abundance, his expression shaped by a lifetime without refusal. Behind him, a steward follows with papyrus and reed pen, recording remarks that will determine where each woman is sent and what purpose she will serve. This one, Senamut says, stopping in front of Kia, the features are suitable, the body as well. At his gesture, a servant steps forward and removes the thin cloth covering her. Acceptable, he continues, strong enough for work, refined enough for presentation. Her origin, daughter of a Nubian chieftain, my lord, taken during the Southern Campaign, literate in her native language, some knowledge of Egyptian script. The word literate shifts the calculation. It limits certain uses. It increases others. She may be trained for internal service, the steward suggests. Administrative duties, the innermost household. Kia understands the phrase now. She has learned enough. The innermost household is not merely where food is prepared or floors are swept. It is where the needs of powerful men are met in ways their official wives cannot acknowledge. The women there exist between slave and concubine, close enough to power to be protected, close enough to be destroyed when favor fades. They bear children who inherit nothing but their father's blood. They are remembered only while they are useful. I will take this one for myself, Senamut says. Prepare her for my chambers tonight. The usual preparations. Bathing, oils, perfumes, cosmetics meant to soften skin and dull resistance. Everything designed to make her body more pleasing in low lamplight. An older woman steps forward, perhaps 40, dressed plainly, but moving with quiet authority. She grips Kia's arm firmly and pulls at her feet. Come, she says in Egyptian, her accent unmistakably Nubian. I will explain what you must know. They pass through corridors that grow narrower and more ornate, leaving the public spaces behind. This part of the house belongs only to those whose lives revolve around service. Inside a small bathing chamber, the woman finally speaks again. My name is Merit, she says. I stood where you stand 22 years ago. What I tell you now will decide whether you survive the next year, or disappear like the women no one names. She gestures to the water, the oils, the tools laid out with clinical precision. What you are about to learn is missing from the histories. Merit continues. They tell us Egypt was a land of wonders, temples, tombs, eternal kings. But monuments are built by hands that are never recorded. Palaces are maintained by bodies hieroglyphs refuse to name. She meets Kia's eyes. The estates of great men were sustained by enslaved women. Their lives erased so completely it is as if they never existed. Tonight, Mary explains, Kia will enter a system refined over centuries, a hierarchy that controls bodies' fertility, obedience, and silence. She will learn what service truly means in the innermost household. She will learn how women like her are used, discarded, or, rarely, reshaped by the very structure meant to break them. This is the story of Kia, daughter of a Nubian leader, who entered the household of Lord Sinister as property and spent 30 years navigating a system designed to consume her. If you want to understand the hidden reality of ancient civilizations, not just their monuments, but the human cost behind them, subscribe to Sinister Empires. Comment below where you're watching from, because Kia is about to cross the threshold into one of the most powerful households in Egypt, and I'm going to explain exactly what that entrance required. But before I describe what happened to her that first night, and in the years that followed, we need to go back. To understand Kia, you must understand Egyptian slavery. It was not a single institution, but a spectrum. At one end were Egyptians who entered temporary servitude to repay debts, retaining legal rights in hope of freedom. At the other were foreign captives, Nubians, Libyans, Asiatics, stripped of status entirely, condemned to permanent, inherited bondage. And within that system, enslaved women faced horrors uniquely their own. Enslaved women were prized not for a single function, but for several at once. They were workers, expected to perform domestic and agricultural labor. They were reproducers, valued for their ability to bear children, who would enlarge a household's human assets. And they were bodies to which owners claimed absolute sexual access, no different in law from livestock or land. The Egyptian language reflected these overlapping expectations. A hemmat referred to a woman assigned to household labor. A sekhet designated a woman reserved for sexual use. A moret described one whose primary function was childbirth. In practice, many enslaved women carried more than one of these classifications at the same time, required to shift roles at their owner's convenience. Within noble estates, these women were arranged into strict internal hierarchies that dictated where they slept, what they ate, how they were treated, and whether any form of advancement was possible. At the lowest level were field laborers and general workers. These women slept in crowded communal quarters. Their bodies were accessible to overseers and fellow slaves alike, without oversight or consequence. Above them were domestic servants assigned to the interior of the household. Their conditions were marginally better, their labor less physically punishing, but their legal status unchanged. Authority determined access to them, not consent. At the top, if such a word could be applied to a structure built on degradation, were the women of the innermost household. These were the personal attendants of the Lord himself, chosen for intelligence, appearance, and adaptability. They performed services that extended far beyond labor. They slept in chambers close to his own. They ate better food, wore finer garments, and received medical care unavailable to other enslaved women. They were the most privileged of the enslaved and the most exposed. Their status existed only because of their function. They were expected to meet not just physical demands, but emotional ones. Entertainment, companionship, and a carefully managed submission that reinforced the Lord's sense of dominance. Their closeness to power shielded them from some abuses, while making them uniquely vulnerable to others. They were valued intensely and discarded just as easily. This was the world Kia was about to enter. This was the structure that would define her existence for the next 30 years. Now return to the bathing chamber, where Merit prepares Kia for her first night in Lord Senumut's service. "You have a choice," Merit said, her hands working scented oil into Kia's skin with practiced efficiency. "Not the choice you want," she added. "Not the choice to refuse or to leave or to be treated as anything other than property, but a choice nonetheless." "What choice?" Kia asked quietly. "How you respond," Merit said. "Whether you remain only a victim of the system or whether you learn to move within it. Whether you allow it to consume you or force it in small ways to serve your survival." Kia studied the older woman's face. The years had left their marks. Tension around the mouth, caution in the eyes born of constant awareness. But there was something else as well. Confidence. the posture of someone who had carved stability out of instability. "You survived," Kia said. "For 22 years," Merritt replied. "And more than survived. I rose." She straightened slightly. "I am now senior woman of the innermost household. I decide assignments. I recommend placements. I influence outcomes my status should never allow." "How?" Kia asked. "By understanding that Lord Senimut wants more than bodies," Merritt said. "He wants usefulness beyond flesh. He wants intelligence, perspective, engagement, without the inconvenience of equality. You became his advisor." Merritt shook her head. "No, advisors can be replaced. I became necessary. Necessary people are protected, because their absence creates inconvenience." Her hands moved lower, methodical and impersonal. "Tonight, he will use you," she said. "That is inevitable. How you respond will determine what happens next. Resist openly, and you mark yourself as someone who must be broken. Endure with awareness, and you become someone worth cultivating." "You want me to pretend?" "I want you to survive," Merritt corrected. "Survival here requires more than endurance. It requires strategy, and the willingness to sacrifice what cannot be preserved." The advice was brutal. It was also honest. Kia had seen the results of defiance. Bodies removed from slave quarters, bruises displayed as warnings. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "You are not doing this from kindness." Merritt smiled faintly. "I am 44. I have perhaps 10 years before age makes me expendable. I need women I have trained, women whose positions depend on me, who will protect my interests when I no longer can. You want me as your protege." "I want you as my investment," Merritt said. "Your education, your intelligence, your adaptability. These are assets. Lord Senimut values assets. If I present you as one I have cultivated, my judgment is affirmed. My position strengthens. And if I fail, then you are simply another woman who could not adapt. I lose nothing but time." The calculation was cold. Kia understood it immediately. "Teach me," she said. "I will learn." The first night was exactly as Merritt had described. Lord Senimut was neither gentle nor overtly cruel. He acted with the indifference of a man exercising unquestioned ownership. He did not ask what Kia wanted. He did not need to. When it was finished, she was led to a small chamber beside his own, better than communal quarters, but unmistakably conditional. Her presence there depended entirely on continued usefulness. She lay in the darkness afterward. She did not cry. Tears would have served no purpose. Worse, they might have been noticed and repeated, passed along by other slaves whose loyalty lay not with shared suffering, but with their own continued survival. So instead, Kia did what Merritt had taught her to do. She thought. She replayed the encounter in her mind, not as something to be endured, but as information to be examined. What had pleased him? What had irritated him? What could be adjusted? What could be leveraged? Each experience became data, stripped of emotion and reorganized into strategy. Over the following weeks, she learned Lord Senimut's patterns. He favored intelligence, but only when it did not challenge his authority. He enjoyed conversation, but despised disagreement. Above all, he wanted submission that appeared willing, an illusion that allowed him to see himself as magnanimous rather than coercive. Kia learned how to give him that illusion. She learned when silence was safer than speech, when engagement was expected, and how to flatter without appearing desperate. She performed the role required of her with precision, while keeping something intact inside herself, an inner core untouched by the performance. Merritt observed her progress with the detached attention of someone evaluating an investment. "Good," she said after the first month. "He has asked for you by name 3 times this week. That is faster than most." Exclusivity, the phase when the Lord stopped rotating through women and focused his attention on one. It never lasted, Merritt warned, but while it did, it created opportunity. Opportunity for what? Kia asked. For access. for proximity. For listening, Merritt replied, information is power, even for slaves, especially for slaves. Kia had already begun collecting it. She listened when Senimut discussed estate matters with visitors. She paid attention when stewards reported harvest yields, debts, and disputes. Letters were read aloud in her presence under the assumption that a Nubian woman could not understand administrative Egyptian. She understood more than they knew. Her upbringing as a chieftain's daughter had included trade languages, diplomacy, and record-keeping. Captivity had only sharpened those skills. Slowly, carefully, she built a mental archive of names, numbers, rivalries, and weaknesses. Years passed. Kia's transformation was not sudden. It unfolded over decades. The first year secured her position as a favored woman. Senimut called for her often, confided small frustrations, allowed her into spaces forbidden to others. She used that access to map the household, learning which overseers were corrupt, which servants were reliable, and where administrative failures were quietly hidden. The second year brought pregnancy. This was expected. Women of the innermost household were denied the contraceptive measures afforded to formal wives. Senimut wanted many children, sons and daughters who would carry his blood even if they carried no inheritance. Kia bore a son. He was taken from her immediately and placed with wet nurses in another wing of the compound. You will see him sometimes, Merritt told her, but he is not yours in the way you imagine. He belongs to the Lord. If you let your attachment show, it will be used against you. Kia understood. She buried the ache when no one could see it. Whatever love she felt, she reshaped into something controlled and deliberate. She would not protect her child through visible devotion. She would protect him by making herself indispensable. In the third year, the balance of power shifted. Merritt fell ill, fever that lingered and refused a break. For 2 weeks, she lay confined to the medical quarters, while other women maneuvered openly for her position. Kia did not compete. Instead, she quietly assumed responsibility. Assignments were managed. Conflicts were resolved. Senimut's routines continued uninterrupted. When Merritt recovered, she returned to find that much of her authority had already transferred. Rather than resenting this, she accelerated the transition. I will not live forever, she said. Better my position pass to someone I chose and someone who seized it. By the 5th year, Kia was her acknowledged second. By the 7th, when Merritt died after the fever returned, Kia stepped seamlessly into the role of senior woman of the innermost household. She was 33 years old, 7 years enslaved, and in practical terms, one of the most powerful women in one of Egypt's wealthiest estates. But power in bondage was never secure. She knew how easily it could vanish. One word from Senimut could undo everything. Send her back to labor, sell her to strangers, erase her influence overnight. So she made herself harder to remove. She expanded her responsibilities beyond the inner household, offering insights drawn from the information she had gathered, patterns of formal advisors overlooked. She cultivated relationships with stewards and overseers, building a web of quiet interdependence that made her absence inconvenient. And then, carefully, she began to change things. Not openly, not radically. She could not dismantle the system that sustained her, but she could blunt its sharpest edges. The changes began small. The preparations inflicted on new women, the cuts around the eyes, the oils designed to irritate skin under the guise of enhancement, were quietly discontinued. Cosmetic preparation remained, but the deliberate pain was removed. She instituted rotations rather than allowing Senimut to fixate destructively on single individuals. Attention was managed. Damage was minimized. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of survival, shaped into influence. And they marked a moment when Kia stopped merely navigating the system and began reshaping from within. When Lord Senimut's attention toward a particular woman became excessive, too intense, too consuming, too likely to result in injury, Kia intervened. Quietly, strategically, she redirected his focus. introducing new acquisitions whose novelty would absorb his interest and allow the endangered woman time to recover. Protection, where possible, extended to the children. Her own son had grown into adolescence and then early adulthood, occupying a minor administrative role within the estate. He was not an heir. Senimut's legitimate children held that status, but he was educated, properly fed, and shielded from the worst degradations of enslavement. Kia ensured that other children born to enslaved women received similar consideration. The old practice of removing infants and discarding them carelessly was replaced with something less brutal, if never truly just. These changes were invisible from the outside. To the world beyond the estate walls, nothing appeared altered. Lord Senimut still owned hundreds of slaves. He still exercised absolute control over the women of the inner household. The structures of domination that defined Egyptian nobility remained intact, but inside the household, lived reality had shifted. Kia had created narrow corridors of safety where none had existed before. Survival became more likely, futures slightly less bleak. Dozens of women experienced a life that, while still constrained by bondage, was less destructive than what had preceded it. She accomplished this while remaining enslaved herself. She continued to serve Senimut's personal needs. She continued performing the role of the favored woman, whose value justified her protection. The compromise was total. She could not shield others without remaining complicit in the system that endangered them. This was the moral contradiction at the heart of her transformation. She had gained influence by becoming indispensable to power. She protected lives by sustaining a structure incapable of protecting anyone in principle. She was at once victim and collaborator, mitigator and enforcer. She had not overturned the system. She had reshaped it from within. Year 15 brought a crisis that tested everything she had built. Senimut's eldest legitimate son, Kamate Wazit, reached adulthood and began asserting authority within the household. He was unlike his father. Where Senimut was controlled and pragmatic, Kamate Wazit was impulsive, cruel without calculation, drawn to inflicting suffering for its own sake rather than for governance. He despised Kia, her influence over his father, her visibility within the estate, her existence as a reminder of appetites he found humiliating. All of it offended him. He was the rightful heir, Egyptian-born, legitimate. She was a Nubian slave who had accumulated authority that, in his view, belonged to men like him. "When my father dies," he told her during one encounter, "your position ends. I will send you where you belong, to the fields, or to overseers who will use you according to your true worth. Your father is still in good health," Kia replied calmly. "That day may be far away, or very near," Kamate Wazit said. "Old men die suddenly, especially when their food passes through many hands." The threat was unmistakable. Kia had long anticipated this danger. She knew Senimut's death would end her protection. She had stored resources, gold hidden in places only she knew. She had cultivated contacts among merchants. She had collected information about Kamate Wazit's own indiscretions. What she had not expected was acceleration. She went to Senimut that evening. They had not shared a bed in years. Age had dulled his appetites, and Kia had long since transitioned fully into the role of advisor. But she still had private access few others possessed. "Your son intends to kill you," she said without preamble, "so that he can destroy me." Senimut studied her. He was nearing 70, his body failing, his mind still sharp, his awareness of mortality growing more acute. "You have proof." "I have his words." He spoke of your meals, of how suddenly old men die. "Young men say foolish things," Senimut replied. "Impatient heirs kill fathers," Kia said. "History is full of them." He was silent for a long time. Then he asked, "What would you have me do?" It was an invitation, recognition that her judgment mattered. "Remove him from the succession," she said. "You have other sons. Appoint an heir suited to administration. Send Kamate Wazit far from the household. where his anger cannot endanger you. And you? I survive, Kia answered. My survival serves your survival, as it always has. It was a logic that had defined their relationship from the beginning. Not affection, not loyalty, mutual utility. Sinister decided over the following weeks. Come 8 ways it was sent to a prestigious administrative post in the southern provinces, honorable, distant, and removed from succession. Another son, Amenhotep, whose temperament mirrored Sinester's own restraint, was named heir. Kia had survived. She had influenced the succession of one of Egypt's great estates. But she had also created an enemy who would remember. Now let us move to year 25. Sinister had died 3 years earlier, peacefully in his bed, with Kia beside him as she had been for more than 2 decades. The transition to his chosen successor, Amenhotep, had been smooth, and Kia's transformation was nearly complete. Kumate, still stationed in the southern provinces, had raged for years over his disinheritance, but had lacked the means to act. Kia's position, meanwhile, had evolved again. She was no longer senior woman of the innermost household. That role had passed to younger women she had trained and guided. She had moved into a new, unprecedented role, advisor. The new lord sought her counsel on estate management, household administration, and political navigation. Technically, she remained a slave. Her legal status had never changed. But in practical terms, the word seemed almost meaningless. She lived in well-appointed quarters, ate well, dressed well, and received medical care that extended her life beyond the typical span for women of her generation. She influenced the treatment of hundreds of other slaves, protected those she chose, and shaped the conditions of daily life for those under her oversight. Kia had achieved something invisible to outsiders. She had secured futures for her children. Not only her son, who held a stable administrative post, but also the 3 daughters she had borne in the inner household. One married a prosperous Fremen merchant. Another served in a temple where her education was valued. The third was attached to a noble household, her mother's influence ensuring her protection and fair treatment. They were not free. Freedom was rarely granted to those born of slave mothers, but they were shielded, positioned, and given opportunities that slavery typically denied. This was Kia's true achievement, not the accumulation of personal authority, not even the mitigation of the household's harshest practices, but the creation of a legacy. She had built a line of descendants who would carry her influence forward into generations she would never see. At 51, she had been enslaved for 25 years, yet she had become something the system had never anticipated, a slave who had bent the rules of bondage to her own designs. But the final years brought complication. Kumate Wazet had never forgiven his disinheritance, and he never stopped blaming Kia. From the southern provinces, he built alliances with officials resentful of the new lord's administration. He accumulated resources, plotted, and waited. When Amenhotep, Senemat's designated successor, died unexpectedly from a fever beyond a physician's skill, Kumate Wazet moved swiftly. Within days, he arrived at the household, asserting his claim as the eldest surviving son of the original lord. He presented documents he insisted validated his rights, and the administration descended into chaos. The designated heir had been Amenhotep's young son, still a child. Regency plans were incomplete. Kumate Wazet exploited the uncertainty, presenting himself as the experienced administrator who could maintain order. One of his first acts was to target Kia, the slave who manipulated my father, who stole my inheritance, who has lived in luxury beyond her rank. Her influence ends today. Her position ends today, he announced. Return her to the status she should never have escaped. Kia was 61. She had survived 35 years through intelligence, strategy, and the cultivation of relationships that made her removal difficult. But those relationships depended on the previous power structure, and that structure was crumbling. She was led to the communal quarters, stripped of her fine clothing, given the rough shifts of a common laborer. In every practical sense, she had returned to the position she had occupied on her first day, kneeling before Sinister for evaluation, But she was not the same woman. She still had resources. Gold hidden where Kametwe's agents had not found it. Relationships with merchants, officials, and priests who owed her favors. Knowledge of Kametwe's vulnerabilities she had stored for emergencies. And most importantly, the loyalty of the household's enslaved population, the women she had protected, the paths to survival she had created, the conditions she had moderated. They would not rebel openly. Slaves who resisted openly were destroyed. But resistance came in subtler forms. Slow work, lost tools, overheard warnings passed to interested parties, and countless small obstructions that hampered the smooth operation of the state. Kametwe's takeover was far from secure. Resolution came through networks Kia had prepared decades earlier. The Temple of Ammon at Thebes maintained enduring relationships with noble households. Priests served as advisors, educators, and legal authorities capable of adjudicating disputes. Kia had cultivated ties with priests who valued her intelligence and her knowledge of household operations. One priest, Yusret, learned her arrest and of Kametwe's sudden seizure of power. He also identified irregularities in the documents the heir had presented, evidence of possible forgery. Yusret brought these concerns to the temple's legal authorities. An investigation was launched. Kametwe's authority was suspended. His orders were reviewed. His treatment of household members scrutinized. For months, Kia remained in the slave quarters, yet her conditions gradually improved as the heir's control weakened. The other slaves protected her, shared food, warned of danger, and maintained the networks of support she had created. The investigation ultimately confirmed what Yusret had suspected. Kametwe's documents were forged. His claim to leadership was invalid. The proper succession and regency for the child heir were restored. Administration was conducted by officials appointed according to the will of the previous lord. Kametwe's was arrested, tried, and executed for forgery and attempted usurpation. His body was denied proper burial. His name was erased from monuments, chiseled away from records with the same thoroughness Egyptian authorities applied to anyone who threatened social order. Kia was reinstated, her position not only restored but strengthened. The Regency Council recognized the value of her experience and relied on her counsel for the administration of the household. She spent her remaining years functioning as a formal administrator, a slave whose practical authority exceeded that of many free Egyptians. She died at 68. She had lived longer than most women of her generation, achieved more than the system that enslaved her ever intended to allow. Her children survived her, shielded by the position she had secured for them. Her grandchildren, though still unfree, benefited from the structures she had built, experiencing lives far more secure and stable than the norm for descendants of enslaved women. The household itself was transformed. The modest improvements Kia had instituted, the protection of vulnerable women, the creation of paths to relative safety within a fundamentally destructive institution, persisted after her death. The women who came after her lived better lives because of systems she had created, even if they never knew her name. This was her legacy, not freedom. She never attained it, nor sought it in earnest. Her power depended on remaining within the system, not fleeing it, not justice. The system endured and would continue for centuries, consuming countless women whose suffering would never be recorded. But change, incremental, compromised, partial change that made the lived experience of enslaved women in one household measurably better than it would otherwise have been. It was never enough. It could never be enough. But it was what she achieved, and more than most in her position could ever achieve. What you have learned tonight challenges a familiar image of ancient Egypt at monuments and museums present. We see the pyramids and marvel at architecture. We see tombs and assume spiritual devotion. We see temples and imagine religious dedication. But we do not see the hands that built them, the bodies that maintained them, the lives consumed in their creation. Kia's story was exceptional. Most enslaved women in Egyptian households never rose to influence. Most did not survive into old age. Most never had the power to protect others or shape their existence. They endured until their strength failed, then were replaced by new acquisitions from southern campaigns or eastern trade routes. But her story reveals what was possible, the paths intelligence, strategy, and careful navigation could create, and the fundamental limitations that even the most successful could not escape. She remained a slave. Her children remained slaves. The system remained unchanged at its core. She had transformed circumstances, not the system. That is a tragedy at the heart of her story. Not that she failed, but that her success was personal, not structural. That her interventions were local, not universal. The same institutions that allowed her rise consumed countless other women without a trace. What Egyptian nobles did to enslaved women was more devastating than mere death. Not because the cruelty was unmatched elsewhere, but because it was systemic, comprehensive, organized, designed to extract value from bodies while denying dignity. Monuments testify to grandeur, but not the cost, the lives consumed to sustain it, the women whose suffering formed its foundation. Remember this when you see images of ancient Egypt. Every palace contained an innermost household. Every great estate held hundreds of enslaved women whose experiences were erased. History is incomplete, shaped by what the powerful preserved and what they chose to suppress. Remember Kia, the chieftain's daughter turned property, who navigated a system designed to destroy her and emerged something it never anticipated. Remember that her transformation required compromise, the acceptance of conditions no human should endure, and the collaboration with structures that oppressed her. Remember that she protected others through these compromises. Remember the women who came after her, whose lives were improved by her foresight. Remember that her complicity was inseparable from her achievements. Remember the moral complexity of survival in systems of oppression, that those who endure often do so at the cost of perpetuating the oppression itself. Remember that Kia's story was one among thousands never recorded. For every enslaved woman who rose, countless others were consumed silently. The system's cost cannot be measured by its rare exceptions. Remember what Egyptian nobles did to enslaved women. Remember the innermost household and the hierarchies of degradation. Remember that civilization's achievements were built on human suffering too often forgotten. Subscribe to Sinister Empires to uncover more hidden histories. Comment below to tell me where you're watching from, and share this video with anyone who thinks they understand ancient Egypt from monuments alone, because the monuments cannot speak for the enslaved. Remember Kia. Remember the nameless thousands. Remember the history that was never written.